The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base valor like a blade through silk. Major General Harrison's weathered face twisted into a grimace as he listened to the transmission from his command bunker, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his battle-worn features. The voice on the other end was fragmented, desperate, barely audible through the electromagnetic interference that plagued the mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. What he heard next would haunt him for the rest of his career. Overlord, this is Reaper 6-1, taking heavy fire, engines compromised, going down behind enemy lines. The transmission dissolved into white noise, leaving only the persistent hum of the communications array and the distant rumble of artillery exchanging fire across the valley. Harrison's aide, Captain Rodriguez, stood frozen beside the radio console, his pen hovering over the incident log as if documenting this moment would somehow make it less real. The general's jaw clenched as he processed the implications. Reaper 6-1 wasn't just any pilot. It was Captain Vera Scarlet Kozlov, the red-haired daughter of Ukrainian immigrants who had clawed her way through flight school despite every obstacle the old boys club could throw at her. She flew the ugliest bird in the Air Force's inventory, an A-10 Thunderbolt II nicknamed Warthog by those who loved her and Flying Bathtub by those who didn't understand her purpose. Harrison fell into the latter category, at least until today. Kozlov had been providing close air support for a Special Forces team trapped in a valley known locally as the Devil's Throat, a narrow gorge where radio signals went to die, and helicopters fell from the sky like autumn leaves. The mission was supposed to be routine: locate and eliminate a high-value target who had been orchestrating attacks on coalition supply lines. But routine missions had a way of becoming disasters when the mountains started swallowing aircraft whole. The silence stretched for 17 minutes. 17 minutes of Harrison staring at the radio, willing it to burst back to life with Kozlov's voice reporting her safe return to base. Instead, what came through the speakers at 4:04 hours was the voice of Reaper 6-2, her wingman Lieutenant Marcus Torch Williams. His words carried the weight of a death sentence. Overlord, this is Torch. Scarlet's bird took a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile, watched her go down in flames. No shoot observed. She's gone, sir. Harrison closed his eyes and began composing the letter he never wanted to write. The letter that would travel across an ocean to a modest apartment in Queens where Kozlov's mother would answer the door to find two uniformed officers bearing news that would shatter her world. The letter that would reduce a brilliant pilot to a footnote in a war that had already consumed too many bright lights. But sometimes, the mountains keep secrets. Sometimes, what appears to be an ending is merely an intermission in a story that refuses to conclude. Captain Vera Kozlov hadn't spoken of her childhood in years, but the memories surfaced now as consciousness returned like a tide creeping across a distant shore. She remembered her father, Dmitri, teaching her to navigate by the stars from their fire escape in Queens, his calloused hands guiding her small fingers to trace constellations that had once guided his own father across the Ukrainian steppes. "The sky," he would whisper in his accented English. "She is the only thing they cannot take from us." Those words echoed through the haze of pain and confusion as Vera's eyes fluttered open to find herself suspended upside down in the mangled cockpit of her A-10, the taste of blood and aviation fuel sharp on her tongue. The Warthog had done what she was built to do: absorb punishment and keep her pilot alive. The titanium bathtub surrounding Vera's seat had deflected shrapnel that would have turned a lesser aircraft into confetti, while the redundant flight controls had responded to her desperate inputs even as hydraulic fluid painted the cockpit in rainbow streaks. But physics had ultimately won, sending 21,000 pounds of military hardware cartwheeling into the rocky face of an Afghan mountainside. Vera's training kicked in with mechanical precision. Check for injuries, concussion probable, left shoulder dislocated, multiple lacerations from shattered glass. Assess the aircraft, total loss, no hope of restart, ejection seat had malfunctioned during the crash sequence. Evaluate the tactical situation, behind enemy lines in hostile territory with no immediate prospect of rescue. The survival checklist her instructors had drilled into her at Luke Air Force Base seemed inadequate now. Academic exercises transformed into life-or-death decisions by the unforgiving mathematics of combat. The silence outside the wreckage was absolute, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through shattered aluminum. But Vera knew this quiet was deceptive. Taliban fighters would be converging on the crash site like antibodies responding to an infection, drawn by the pillar of black smoke that marked her aircraft's grave. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the first curious locals arrived, maybe 30 if she was lucky. After that, her options would narrow to capture or death, with the former leading inevitably to the latter, once her intelligence value was exhausted. With gritted teeth, Vera began the excruciating process of extracting herself from the inverted cockpit. Her survival vest caught on twisted metal, forcing her to contort her injured shoulder in ways that sent lightning bolts of agony down her spine. The emergency beacon on her vest chirped steadily, an electronic heartbeat that would guide rescue forces to her location, if any were coming. She had no way of knowing that General Harrison, 200 miles away, was already writing her obituary. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed off the canyon walls as Vera finally freed herself from the wreckage. Time had run out faster than expected, but the daughter of Ukrainian immigrants who had survived Stalin's purges and Hitler's invasion had not raised a quitter. Vera checked her sidearm, a Beretta M9 that felt impossibly heavy in her injured grip, and began to climb. 3 days later, the mountain had taught General Harrison a lesson in humility that no staff college could provide. The search and rescue teams he'd reluctantly authorized had found only scattered debris and oil stains on the rocks, confirming his assumption that Captain Kozlov had become another casualty statistic in a war that devoured young lives with industrial efficiency. The paperwork was completed. The notification teams had delivered their grim news to a grieving mother in Queens, and Harrison had moved on to the next crisis, demanding his attention. The mountains of Afghanistan were littered with the wreckage of aircraft and the bones of aircrews who had dared to challenge their ancient sovereignty. But on the third morning after the crash, as Harrison reviewed intelligence reports over his ritual cup of coffee, the radio in his command bunker burst to life with a transmission that defied explanation. The voice was hoarse, barely recognizable, but the call sign was unmistakable. "Overlord, this is Reaper 6-1. Still breathing. Request immediate extraction." Captain Rodriguez nearly dropped his coffee mug as the impossible words echoed through the concrete-walled room. Harrison's first instinct was to dismiss the transmission as enemy propaganda, a crude psychological operation designed to manipulate coalition forces into exposing rescue assets to ambush. The Taliban had used such tactics before, broadcasting fake distress calls on captured radios to lure helicopters into kill zones. But something in the voice's cadence, the specific terminology used, the subtle inflections that couldn't be easily faked, suggested this was no deception. "Reaper 6-1, authenticate Foxtrot 7, Harrison barked into the microphone, demanding the authentication code that only Kozlov would know. The silence stretched for 15 seconds that felt like hours, filled only by the crackle of atmospheric static and the general's increasingly rapid heartbeat. When the response came, it carried the weight of resurrection. "Overlord, authentication is Whiskey Delta 49. And sir, I'm hurt bad but still in the fight." The authentication was correct, but Harrison's military mind struggled to process the implications. According to every report, every witness account, every piece of evidence, Captain Kozlov was dead, her aircraft destroyed, her body presumably scattered across a remote mountainside. Yet here she was, speaking to him across the ether like a voice from beyond the grave. The general's worldview, built on the certainty of military science and the finality of combat reports, began to crack like ice under spring sun. Within minutes, Harrison's command center transformed into a hive of activity. Communications specialists worked frantically to triangulate Kozlov's position, while intelligence analysts pored over satellite imagery, searching for signs of life in a landscape that had seemed definitively dead. The general found himself hoping for a miracle while simultaneously preparing for disappointment, his emotional armor struggling to protect him from the possibility that one of his pilots might actually survive the unsurvivable. The extraction mission that followed would become legend, whispered about in ready rooms and officer clubs for years to come. It began with uncertainty and evolved into something approaching the miraculous, a testament to the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to accept defeat. But as Harrison coordinated the rescue effort, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something larger than a simple survival story, perhaps a fundamental shift in his understanding of what courage actually meant. The mountain that had swallowed Captain Kozlov whole was about to give her back, transformed by 3 days of survival into something harder than the stone that surrounded her. And General Harrison, who had written her off as just another casualty of war, was about to learn why his subordinates called her Scarlet, not just for her red hair, but for her ability to paint the sky with fire and emerge from the flames unbroken. The rescue operation Harrison authorized represented the kind of calculated risk that kept generals awake at night, balancing the precious lives of rescue personnel against the slim possibility of saving a single pilot. Two HH-60 Pave Hawks from the 56th Rescue Squadron lifted off from Bagram Air Base at 1400 hours, their rotors beating the thin mountain air into submission as they began the treacherous journey toward Kozlov's last known position. Accompanying them was a pair of F-16 Fighting Falcons providing top cover and an AC-130 Spectre gunship, whose sensors could peer through darkness and detect the heat signature of a single human being from miles away. Captain Rodriguez monitored the radio traffic from the command bunker, his earlier skepticism gradually giving way to grudging admiration for the woman who had somehow survived 3 days in territory where captured coalition personnel typically measured their life expectancy in hours rather than days. The Taliban controlled these mountains with the confidence of those who had seen empires come and go, who understood that patience and terrain were more valuable than advanced weaponry. At 1547 hours, the lead Pave Hawk made contact with the impossible. Captain Vera Kozlov, alive but barely mobile, had managed to evade capture by climbing higher into the mountains rather than attempting the obvious escape routes toward friendly territory. Her survival training had taught her that the enemy would expect her to flee downhill, toward the valley floors where helicopter extraction was possible. Instead, she had done the counterintuitive, scaling nearly vertical rock faces with a dislocated shoulder and multiple injuries, seeking refuge in caves that had sheltered Afghan fighters for millennia. Rescue 1, I have visual on Reaper 6-1, the Pave Hawk pilot's voice crackled through the radio. She's approximately 200 meters up a cliff face, in what appears to be a natural cave formation. Advise we cannot approach for normal extraction procedures. The pilot, Major Sarah Chen, had flown over 60 rescue missions in Afghanistan and had never encountered anything quite like this. The woman she could see through her aircraft's advanced optics looked more like a mountain climber than a downed pilot, having somehow fashioned climbing equipment from parachute cord and aircraft debris. Harrison listened to the radio chatter with growing amazement. Kozlov had not merely survived, she had improvised, adapted, and overcome challenges that would have broken lesser individuals. Her climb up the cliff face represented not just physical endurance but tactical brilliance, positioning herself in a location where she could observe enemy movement while remaining effectively invisible from ground level. The general began to understand why his combat-experienced pilots spoke of Scarlet with a mixture of respect and awe. The extraction itself required innovations in aerial rescue techniques. Unable to hover close enough for a normal pickup, the Pave Hawk crew deployed their rescue specialist, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, on a 200-foot cable into the cave where Kozlov waited. Torres later described finding a pilot who had transformed her temporary shelter into a fortified position, complete with early warning systems fashioned from aircraft debris, and carefully rationed survival supplies that should have lasted 1 day, but had been stretched to 3 through meticulous resource management. She wasn't just surviving, Torres would tell debriefing officers later. She was planning her next move, studying the enemy patrol patterns, preparing to continue the fight if rescue didn't come. This was not the behavior of a victim awaiting salvation, but of a warrior who had simply changed venues. Harrison, monitoring the extraction in real time, felt his preconceptions crumbling like ancient mortar. The journey back to base took 47 minutes, with Kozlov drifting in and out of consciousness as military medics worked to stabilize her condition. Her last transmission before medical personnel sedated her would echo in Harrison's memory for years. Overlord, Reaper 6-1 returning to base. Mission incomplete. Request permission to refly when able. Even semi-conscious and barely alive, she was thinking about getting back in the cockpit. As the rescue helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Valor, Harrison found himself walking toward the flight line with uncharacteristic urgency. He needed to see this impossible pilot with his own eyes, to understand how someone he had written off as another statistic had managed to rewrite the fundamental assumptions about survival and determination. The general who had begun this day expecting to mourn a dead subordinate was about to meet a living legend. The base hospital at Forward Operating Base Valor had seen its share of miracles, but Captain Vera Kozlov's arrival created a stir that echoed through every corner of the facility. Medical personnel who had worked in combat zones for years found themselves marveling at injuries that should have been fatal, survival stories that defied medical logic, and a patient who seemed more concerned about her aircraft's status than her own traumatic wounds. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief trauma surgeon, later described Kozlov as the most stubborn patient I've ever tried to keep in bed. The extent of Kozlov's injuries painted a picture of survival that bordered on the miraculous. Beyond the dislocated shoulder and multiple lacerations, she had sustained a grade 2 concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and severe dehydration. Her hands were raw from climbing bare rock, her flight suit was shredded beyond recognition, and her body showed the cumulative effects of 3 days spent fighting the elements with minimal food and water. Yet her first coherent question to Dr. Walsh was whether her A-10 could be salvaged for parts. General Harrison's visit to the hospital came 6 hours after Kozlov's arrival, when she was finally conscious enough for conversation. He found her sitting up in bed despite medical orders, studying a tactical map of the region where she had crashed. Her red hair was matted with dried blood and dust. Her face bore the gaunt look of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink, but her green eyes held a clarity that surprised the general. This was not a broken pilot grateful for rescue. This was a warrior analyzing her next engagement. "Captain Kozlov," Harrison began, his voice carrying the formal tone he typically used with subordinates. "I'm glad to see you're alive. We all thought—" He paused, struggling to find words that didn't sound like an admission of premature defeat. "The reports indicated your aircraft was destroyed with no survivors." Kozlov's response came without hesitation, delivered in a voice hoarse from exposure but steady with conviction. "Sir, the aircraft was destroyed, but the pilot was merely temporarily grounded. I request permission to review the mission parameters and identify why our intelligence on enemy surface-to-air capabilities was insufficient." Her clinical analysis of her own near-death experience struck Harrison as either remarkably professional or mildly insane. The conversation that followed would later be classified and restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances, but its essence transformed Harrison's understanding of leadership under extreme pressure. Kozlov described her survival not as a series of fortunate events, but as a sequence of tactical decisions, each building upon the last to create a coherent strategy for staying alive behind enemy lines. She had analyzed enemy patrol patterns, identified their communication protocols, and even gathered intelligence on their defensive positions that could prove valuable for future operations. "General," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I observed at least 3 previously unknown anti-aircraft positions during my time on the mountain. If we're going to continue operating in that sector, ground forces need to be aware of the upgraded threat environment." Harrison found himself taking notes, realizing that this debriefing was providing actionable intelligence that could save lives on future missions. Dr. Walsh entered the room during their conversation, carrying test results that painted a clinical picture of near starvation and exhaustion. But when she recommended extended bed rest and possible medical evacuation to Germany for comprehensive treatment, Kozlov's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Doc, how long until I can pass a flight physical?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to conventional medical wisdom. Harrison left the hospital that evening with his worldview fundamentally altered. The pilot he had written off as another casualty had not merely survived. She had turned survival into a form of warfare, gathering intelligence and maintaining tactical awareness even while fighting for her life. For the first time in his career, the general found himself wondering if he truly understood what courage meant. The story of Captain Kozlov's survival spread through forward operating base valor like wildfire through dry grass, transforming from whispered rumors into fully formed legend within hours of her return. Personnel who had never spoken to her directly found themselves recounting details of her ordeal with the confidence of eyewitnesses, while maintenance crews who had worked on her aircraft spoke with newfound reverence about the A-10's ability to protect its pilot, even in the most catastrophic circumstances. The nickname Scarlet took on new meaning, no longer simply a reference to her hair color, but a testament to her ability to emerge from impossible situations marked by conflict but unbroken by defeat. In the days following her rescue, Kozlov's hospital room became an unofficial pilgrimage site for pilots and ground personnel seeking to understand how someone had managed to survive what everyone else considered unsurvivable. She received visitors with the same clinical precision she applied to mission planning, turning each conversation into a learning opportunity. Young pilots expected war stories and heroic narratives, but instead received tactical briefings on enemy capabilities and detailed analyses of equipment performance under extreme conditions. Lieutenant Williams, her wingman who had reported her death 3 days earlier, struggled to reconcile the woman sitting before him with the flaming wreckage he had watched disappear into the mountainside. Torch had flown combat missions for 18 months, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the guilt of mourning someone who turned out to be alive, fighting, and gathering intelligence while he was filling out casualty reports. His reunion with Kozlov carried the weight of resurrection and the awkwardness of premature grief. "Marcus," Kozlov said during his visit, her voice gentle but direct, "you did exactly what you should have done. No shoot, no radio contact, aircraft completely destroyed. Anyone would have made the same assessment. The fact that I survived doesn't make your reporting correct. It makes me lucky." Her ability to absolve his guilt while maintaining professional objectivity demonstrated the emotional intelligence that complemented her tactical brilliance. General Harrison found himself returning to the hospital more frequently than medical visits typically warranted, drawn by curiosity about this pilot who had forced him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human limitations. Their conversations ranged from tactical analysis to philosophical discussions about duty, survival, and the psychological tools necessary to function under extreme pressure. Kozlov spoke about her 3 days on the mountain not as traumatic experience, but as advanced training, albeit with significantly higher stakes than typical exercises. "Sir," she explained during one of these visits, "survival isn't about waiting for rescue. It's about continuing the mission with available resources. My mission didn't end when the aircraft was destroyed. It adapted to new parameters. I was still a coalition asset in enemy territory with the ability to gather intelligence and potentially influence tactical outcomes. Her matter-of-fact description of warfare from a cave made Harrison realize that some people were simply built differently. Dr. Walsh's medical reports painted a picture of recovery that defied normal healing timelines. Kozlov's injuries, while serious, responded to treatment with unusual efficiency. Her body seemed to possess the same engineering redundancy as the aircraft she flew, damaged but functional, capable of operating at reduced capacity while systems repaired themselves. When asked about her rapid recovery, Kozlov attributed it to Ukrainian genetics and stubborn determination, inherited from grandparents who had survived Stalin's manufactured famine. As her strength returned, so did her impatience with medical restrictions. Dr. Walsh found herself negotiating with a patient who treated recovery like a mission timeline, setting personal benchmarks for mobility, coordination, and physical fitness that exceeded standard medical protocols. "Captain," the doctor finally said, "you're approaching rehabilitation like it's flight training." Kozlov's response was immediate, "Because it is. Every day I'm not flying is a day. The enemy owns more sky than they should." The transformation of opinion regarding Captain Kozlov reached its culmination during her first appearance at the evening briefing since her crash. General Harrison had invited her to provide intelligence gathered during her survival experience, expecting a brief tactical overview. Instead, she delivered a comprehensive analysis of enemy capabilities, defensive positions, and communication protocols that revealed the kind of situational awareness typically available only through extensive surveillance operations. The room full of seasoned combat veterans found themselves taking notes from a pilot who had turned being shot down into a reconnaissance mission. On the seventh day after her rescue, Captain Kozlov received clearance from Dr. Walsh to return to limited duty, though flying status remained pending completion of comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations. Her first stop was the maintenance hangar, where the wreckage of her A-10 had been transported for investigation. Standing before the twisted metal that had saved her life, she placed her hand on a section of titanium armor plating scarred by shrapnel but still intact. The maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, watched her examine the wreckage with the intensity of someone studying a religious artifact. "She brought you home, didn't she, Captain?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the reverence mechanics reserved for aircraft that had performed beyond specifications under impossible conditions. The A-10 had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft, had continued flying with systems failures that should have resulted in immediate loss of control, and had ultimately protected its pilot during a crash that scattered debris across half a mountainside. Kozlov's response surprised everyone present. "No, Sergeant. We brought each other home. She kept me alive, I kept her flying, and together we completed the mission." Her words reflected a relationship between pilot and aircraft that transcended the merely mechanical, suggesting a partnership forged in combat and tempered by survival. The assembled maintenance personnel, hardened veterans who had seen aircraft return from missions held together by hydraulic fluid and determination, found themselves nodding in recognition of a bond they understood but rarely witnessed so perfectly expressed. That afternoon, General Harrison made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He approved Captain Kozlov's request to return to flying status pending completion of her medical clearance, but with one significant change: she would be transitioning from routine close air support missions to specialized operations requiring the kind of tactical flexibility and survival skills she had demonstrated during her 3 days behind enemy lines. The pilot who had been written off as a casualty was about to become one of the Air Force's most valuable assets. The psychological evaluation that would determine Captain Kozlov's fitness to return to combat flying represented the final hurdle in her resurrection from presumed casualty to active pilot. Dr. Patricia Morgan, the base psychiatrist, had conducted over 300 such evaluations during her deployment to Afghanistan, but none quite like this. Typically, pilots who had survived aircraft crashes struggled with trauma responses, survivor guilt, or loss of confidence in their equipment. Kozlov presented with none of these symptoms, instead displaying what Dr. Morgan described as adaptive hypervigilance, a heightened state of tactical awareness that seemed to be her normal operational mode rather than a stress response. "Captain," Dr. Morgan began during their first session, "most pilots who have experienced what you've been through show some signs of post-traumatic stress, sleep disturbances, anxiety about flying, reluctance to discuss the crash. You seem remarkably unaffected by what was clearly a traumatic experience." Her clinical observations were accurate but incomplete, missing the fundamental aspect of Kozlov's personality that transformed potential trauma into tactical knowledge. Kozlov's response revealed the philosophical framework that had enabled her survival. "Doctor, trauma implies unexpected damage to normal functioning. What happened to me was an extension of combat operations under different parameters. I was trained to survive behind enemy lines, to adapt to equipment failures, to function under extreme stress. The crash didn't traumatize me, it validated my training." Her matter-of-fact analysis of near-death experience as professional development left Dr. Morgan scrambling to apply standard psychological models to a decidedly non-standard patient. The evaluation sessions became increasingly complex as Dr. Morgan struggled to assess the mental health of someone whose response to extreme stress was to become more tactically effective. Kozlov described her 3 days on the mountain not as a period of terror and desperation, but as intensive training under realistic conditions. She had analyzed enemy patrol patterns, identified defensive vulnerabilities, and maintained situational awareness that would prove valuable for future operations. From a clinical perspective, this represented remarkably healthy coping mechanisms. From a human perspective, it suggested someone whose relationship with danger operated on entirely different principles than normal individuals. General Harrison followed the evaluation process with intense interest, recognizing that Kozlov's return to flying status would set precedents for how the Air Force handled pilots who had survived extreme situations. Her case challenged conventional wisdom about trauma, recovery, and the psychological requirements for combat effectiveness. Military medicine had extensive experience treating pilots who had been broken by combat. It had little guidance for pilots who seemed to have been strengthened by it. The breakthrough in Dr. Morgan's evaluation came during their 4th session, when she asked Kozlov about her emotional state during the most dangerous moments of her survival experience. "When you were climbing that cliff face with a dislocated shoulder, knowing that enemy forces were searching for you, what were you feeling?" The question was designed to uncover suppressed trauma or delayed emotional responses to life-threatening stress. Kozlov's answer surprised the psychiatrist. "I felt useful. For the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, I was operating at full capacity, using all of my training and experience to solve a complex tactical problem. The enemy thought they had eliminated a threat, but instead they had created an intelligence-gathering asset in their own backyard. I was doing exactly what I was trained to do, just from an unusual platform." Her description of survival as professional fulfillment suggested psychological resilience that exceeded normal parameters. Dr. Morgan's final report would become required reading for military psychologists dealing with similar cases in the future. She concluded that Captain Kozlov represented an exceptional example of successful adaptation to extreme stress, but warned that her psychological profile might not be replicable or even desirable in typical military personnel. "The captain's response to trauma is functional but unusual," she wrote. "She has internalized combat stress to such a degree that she appears to function optimally under conditions that would incapacitate most individuals. The recommendation was clear: return to flying status with notation that Captain Kozlov might be particularly well suited for high-risk operations requiring independent decision-making under extreme conditions. Her survival experience had not broken her. It had revealed psychological capabilities that made her more valuable, not less, as a combat pilot. General Harrison read the evaluation with growing recognition that he had discovered something rare in the military bureaucracy, someone whose exceptional performance transcended standard metrics. 2 weeks after her rescue, Captain Kozlov stood on the flight line at Forward Operating Base Valor, watching maintenance crews perform final checks on a replacement A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft was identical in specifications to the one she had crashed in the mountains, but this machine carried no history, no shared experience of survival under impossible conditions. Building trust with a new aircraft was like developing rapport with a new wingman, essential for survival, but requiring time and mutual testing under increasingly demanding conditions. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with the technical inspection clipboard, his weathered face carrying the satisfaction of a professional who had prepared machinery for combat with meticulous attention to detail. "She's ready, Captain. All systems checked, weapons loaded, fuel topped off. This bird's got the same modifications as your last ride: upgraded targeting systems, reinforced landing gear, and enough ammunition to make the Taliban think twice about surface-to-air missiles." His pride in his work was evident, but so was his understanding of the weight carried by pilots who trusted their lives to mechanical systems. Kozlov accepted the clipboard and reviewed the inspection results with the same systematic approach she applied to survival planning. Every component had been tested beyond standard requirements, every system redundancy verified, every possible failure mode anticipated and addressed. The maintenance crew had prepared her aircraft not just to fly, but to survive the kind of punishment that had destroyed her previous machine. Their professional dedication represented a form of worship directed toward the unforgiving gods of mechanical reliability. General Harrison observed the pre-flight procedures from his command post, monitoring radio traffic that indicated routine preparations for what would be anything but a routine mission. Kozlov had requested permission to return to the same operational sector where she had been shot down, arguing that her survival experience had provided intelligence about enemy capabilities that could only be properly exploited through direct action. Her first mission back would take her over the same mountains that had nearly claimed her life, but this time she would be hunting the surface-to-air missile sites that had brought down her aircraft. The transformation in base personnel's attitude toward Captain Kozlov was evident in the crowd that gathered to watch her departure. Pilots who had initially dismissed her as another lucky survivor now spoke of her, with the reverence reserved for combat veterans who had proven themselves under fire. Maintenance crews who had worked on her aircraft treated the machine with additional care, understanding that it would be flown by someone who had demonstrated the ability to survive when survival seemed impossible. Even the base support personnel, who typically paid little attention to individual flight operations, paused in their duties to witness her return to combat. At 14:30 hours, Captain Kozlov advanced the throttles on her new A-10 and began her taxi toward the active runway. The familiar weight of the aircraft, the reassuring growl of the twin turbofan engines, the comfortable restriction of her flight harness, all of these sensations represented a return to normalcy after 2 weeks of medical evaluations and administrative procedures. But this was not the same pilot who had taken off on a routine close air support mission 3 weeks earlier. This was someone who had been tested by forces more demanding than any training program, and had emerged with capabilities that exceeded her original specifications. The radio crackled with routine departure instructions, But underlying the professional communications was an emotional subtext that everyone involved recognized but nobody explicitly acknowledged. Reaper 6-1, cleared for takeoff, winds light and variable, contact departure control passing through 3,000 feet. The tower controller's voice carried the same measured tone used for hundreds of previous departures, but his personal investment in this particular mission was evident to anyone who knew the story behind the call sign. As her A-10 lifted off from the runway and turned toward the mountains where she had nearly died, Captain Kozlov felt the convergence of past experience and future possibility. The sky that had once seemed hostile now felt familiar, a medium through which she could project force and gather intelligence with equal facility. Her aircraft climbed steadily toward the peaks that had tested her survival skills and found them adequate, ready to complete the mission that had been interrupted by enemy action but never truly abandoned. General Harrison watched the departure with emotions that defied his professional training. The pilot he had written off as another casualty was returning to combat with enhanced capabilities and a deeper understanding of what survival required. As her aircraft disappeared into the mountain haze, he realized that some people were not just survivors. They were transformative forces that turned defeat into victory through sheer refusal to accept conventional limitations. The mission profile that took Captain Kozlov back to the Devil's Throat differed significantly from her previous flight over the same terrain. This time, she carried specialized ordnance designed to eliminate surface-to-air missile sites. Her aircraft was equipped with enhanced electronic countermeasures, and her understanding of enemy defensive positions had been enriched by 3 days of ground-level observation. Most importantly, she flew with the confidence of someone who had already survived the worst the enemy could deliver and emerged with her tactical capabilities intact. Intelligence reports indicated that the Taliban had reinforced their anti-aircraft defenses in the sector, apparently believing that their successful engagement of coalition aircraft would discourage future operations in the area. This represented a fundamental misunderstanding of American military doctrine and an even more serious miscalculation regarding the psychological profile of pilots like Captain Kozlov. Rather than avoiding areas where aircraft had been lost, the Air Force typically responded with increased attention and more sophisticated countermeasures. At 14:47 hours, Kozlov established radio contact with the forward air controller supporting ground operations in the valley below. Staff Sergeant Thompson, operating from a concealed observation post on the eastern ridge, had been tracking enemy movement patterns for 72 hours and had identified 3 previously unknown missile sites that matched the descriptions Kozlov had provided during her survival debriefing. Reaper 6-1, I have multiple targets for your consideration, all consistent with the intelligence you gathered during your extended stay in the neighborhood. The irony was not lost on any of the participants that Kozlov's crash had ultimately provided more valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities than her original mission would have generated. Her 3 days of ground-level observation had revealed defensive positions, communication patterns, and tactical procedures that would have been invisible from normal flight altitudes. In military parlance, her survival experience had transformed a routine close air support mission into a comprehensive intelligence-gathering operation. Kozlov's approach to the target area reflected her enhanced understanding of enemy capabilities. Rather than following predictable flight paths that had made her previous aircraft vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles, she used terrain masking and unpredictable altitude changes to complicate enemy targeting solutions. Her aircraft danced through the mountain valleys like a deadly ballet, presenting minimal exposure time while maintaining weapon solutions on the targets she had personally observed during her survival experience. The first missile site revealed itself exactly as Kozlov had predicted, positioned in a rocky outcropping that provided natural camouflage while offering clear lines of sight toward the valley floor where coalition aircraft typically operated. Her AGM-65 Maverick missile eliminated the position with surgical precision, the explosion echoing off canyon walls that had witnessed her desperate climb to safety 3 weeks earlier. The destruction of equipment that had nearly killed her represented both tactical success and personal vindication. "Good hit, Reaper 6-1," Thompson reported from his observation post. "Target destroyed. Secondary explosions indicate significant ammunition storage at that location. Enemy personnel are beginning to evacuate the area." The withdrawal patterns Thompson observed matched the intelligence Kozlov had gathered during her survival experience, confirming her assessment of enemy tactical doctrine and defensive procedures. The second and third missile sites fell to Kozlov's attack with similar efficiency, each strike guided by intelligence she had gathered. While fighting for survival in the very mountains she was now attacking from, the